attract demand have been far, far fewer. If Adam Smith's observation is to be taken seriously that consumption is the sole end and purpose of production, we would do well to consider not only the increasing supply of products, but also the shifting patterns of consumption that shaped demand. When modern economists talk about the concept of demand, they usually distinguish between individuals and markets. Market demand is essentially the total of all individual demand in a given market. The concept works relatively well in an economic system that favors individual decision-making. But it works less well when looking at the 17th century. There are several reasons, all having to do with the differences in consumption patterns. So let me start with an example in order to illustrate what I mean. In 1575, a man named Gottschalk Weinsberg and his family moved into the family estate in the German city of Cologne. They took up residence as a joint household with the families of his brother Hermann and two unmarried sisters and two nephews. The Weinsberg brothers had different occupations, but both were considered what might be middle class, though far from wealthy. The household consisted of three domestic groups, each living in separate dwellings in the family estate. Hermann and the two nephews lived in one building, the two sisters lived in another, and Gottschalk and his immediate family lived in a third, larger building that also served as the common space for the newly established joint household. The Weinsbergs agreed that Gottschalk's house would be where the common meals would be taken. All members of the household ate at the same table. The household consisted of at least 9 people, more if they had servants. Now, when Gottschalk Weinsberg moved in, the brothers also agreed on how the household budget would be divided. All living expenses, except for clothing and entertainment, were to be divided among the family members, with Hermann paying for the shares of the two sisters and the two nephews. Gottschalk paid for himself, his wife, a niece, and an illegitimate son who lived with him. The vast majority of these shared expenses were for food. The household as a group determined, or negotiated really, what kinds of food they would purchase, keeping in mind the social norms of the time. While in modern times, we tend to think in terms of individual or market demand, what is important to notice in this example is that things look pretty much differently before the Industrial Revolution. The earlier demand and consumption factors are better considered within the context of the household economy. By the 17th century, the so-called European marriage pattern, which refers to a relatively later age of marriage, and the couple establishing a new household separate from the couple's parents, was increasingly the norm. But household composition continued to vary considerably across the continent. Even within a more nuclear family arrangement, household decision-making on consumption created demand for products far more than individual decision-making. And decision-making was constrained by society. So back to demand and supply. Economists point out that when prices for goods are low, or when they're falling, the demand for them typically increases. Conversely, when prices are high, or when they're rising, producers are incented to increase the supply of these goods. Looking at this historically, to make sense of the significant increase in the supply of goods that occurred even before the Industrial Revolution, we need to understand the sources of demand at the time. Absent demand, producers would have no incentive to try to increase supply through more workers or technological innovations or importing from abroad. So in the absence of reliable documentary records, in the period leading up to the Industrial Revolution, we can posit that demand for goods must have been high, creating the environment to spur production, innovation, and writ large, an industrial revolution. The basic premise of this is that long-term economic growth predated the Industrial Revolution. In this view, a significant and growing demand for more goods took place first, creating serious bottlenecks with the production methods of the time. Initially, supply did not rise as quickly as demand, and the disconnect launched changes in production. So a period of increasing demand wasn't satisfied until the Industrial Revolution came along with its focus on supply to solve the problem. Many scholars have used the alternative Industrius Revolution to describe the period between about 1600 and 1800 when we believe that demand intensified. The increase would have been based on household decision-making, as at the multifamily Weinsberg compound. Additionally, the idea of an industrious revolution is based on the notion that by the 17th century, people were working more, which had the potential to increase their incomes. And finally, we will want to examine changes in taste and preferences as we seek to understand changes in consumption. Now, not all scholars agree with this characterization of an industrious revolution, but it is a useful model in which to consider consumption during this period. There are some other issues that we need to address when we consider this model, not all of them necessarily supporting a revolution in industriousness. First is the idea of the household economy itself. There were several types of household economies, but we will consider the differences in consumption between two of them, the rural and the urban household. The definition of a household has varied over time, but for the period I'm referring to, roughly the years 1500 to 1800, a household was a family-based entity, even though not all members of a household were necessarily related, in which production, consumption, and resource distribution occurred. Prior to industrialization, most production took place at the household level. All of the individuals in the household worked. This was true whether production was controlled by a guild, which was essentially an association of craftsmen or merchants, who controlled production of a particular product or product type within a town, or in rural areas where guilds rarely exercised control over production. So the household was the locus of production and consumption. That said, probably the most powerful organizing institution for production in pre-modern Europe, even within the household, was the guild. The guild's origins date far back into the medieval period, but such labor associations continued to regulate production to one degree or another, in some cases, into the 19th century. The guilds themselves produced nothing. Their chief function was to regulate entry into a craft through controlling apprenticeships and admitting members as journeymen or masters, and then setting and supervising quality controls. Guilds were urban institutions, controlling production within the town borders. Most craft production, weaving, baking, smithing, etc., was located in towns and controlled by guilds. Rural industry was usually not regulated by guilds. For example, because mines in England were outside of towns, miners had no guild. However, the specific industry is no guide to the presence of a guild. In the town of Liège, in modern-day Belgium, mines were usually located within towns, and miners were members of a guild. The power of the guild, both politically and economically, waxed and waned over the centuries and in different regions. But guild regulation was almost always focused on household production. And guild-organized production itself took place mostly in individual households at the hands of the master and his family. Another form of organization for household production was something called the putting out system. In the putting out system, merchants entered production by supplying craftsmen not only with a market for their products, but also with credit and even equipment. Merchants also connected various functions. For example, a merchant might provide raw materials and equipment, wool and a spinning machine, to workers in the countryside, paying the spinners a piece rate. The merchant might then transport the threads to the town and engage a weaver to make the cloth with his threads, paying the weaver a piece rate as well. That merchant might also extend credit to a craftsman for the purchase of equipment or raw materials. While a guild might regulate the quality of the product and ensure that the craftsman was a guild member, the putting out system still concentrated production within households. Nevertheless, yet another organizational form, known only rarely in medieval Europe, began to move production outside of the households during the 16th century. This was the factory. Although the factory wouldn't become commonplace until after about 1750, some factories were set up earlier, primarily in the textile industries. It should come as no surprise that guilds opposed factories because they removed production from guild regulation, and the state rarely favored this transition. But factories can be found in limited numbers all over Europe, even before industrialization. In contrast with guild-directed production in urban areas, the putting out system was often adapted to rural households that could be employed in artisanal production, like spinning and weaving, among other things, as a supplement to traditional agricultural production. The putting out system was employed by enterprising merchants in rural areas to avoid guild regulations and to tap into an underemployed agricultural workforce during off-seasons. This provided rural workers with an additional income and helped elevate consumption in the countryside above the subsistence level. In order for any household to increase its consumption, urban or rural, it needed to produce more goods for sale. The guilds were more concerned with quality than volume in order to keep prices for their products high. At the same time, merchants who invested in the putting out system wanted to increase production as a way to increase their profits. They did this by selling greater quantities of their products at a somewhat lower price than the same goods could fetch in the towns. The higher volumes would still give them a good return. So there were external stimuli to increasing household production, even if that meant somewhat lower quality than guilds would allow. Given the steady but very slow pace of technological innovation at the time, the best way to increase production was to work more. In other words, producers needed to be more industrious. Some scholars have suggested that is exactly what producers did in order to increase household income. Unfortunately, the evidence is circumstantial at best. Some scholars using indirect methods at calculating hours worked, and primarily in agriculture, suggest that work hours increased only slightly in the centuries before industrialization. However, if we consider all the variables that might play a role in increased production, things like new technologies and production methods, divisions of labor, and the difference between urban and rural industries, a case can be made for an increase in output, if not necessarily in hours worked per family. The principal idea to remember is that after about the year 1500, European households began to be able to obtain enough resources to raise consumption above the subsistence level, and this spurred increases in demand. Now, let's turn to a discussion of consumption in the period immediately before industrialization. Modern consumption theory would have us believe that consumption is determined by the autonomous individual who, with seemingly perfect knowledge of the full range of goods and prices, selects the best bundle of goods he can afford. The problem with applying this theory to the distant past is that the pre-modern individual was not autonomous. He or she was typically a member of a household economy. And consumption decisions were made by groups of individuals with unequal status within that household and who were constrained by social conventions and traditions. The most important item of consumption during all of human history was, of course, food. Until very modern times, most people were engaged in some aspect of agricultural production. If we stop and think about it for a minute, we can see how consumption theory, focused as it is on the individual, fails to account for the fact that food is acquired by and for households, not normally just for individuals, except in the case of the one-person household, which was rare before modern times. Feeding the household is the greatest concern of all populations. The vicissitudes of war and disease and famine due to crop failures exerted an almost constant pressure on the household, particularly on the lowest status households. Consumption patterns in rural areas were also very different from urban areas, and country living was no guarantee that people could grow all the food they needed. Data for the 16th century Denmark illustrate that even at the subsistence level, some trade was required in order to meet all of the dietary needs of peasant villages. For example, some areas of Jutland in southern Denmark are ideally suited for cattle herding, while others are better suited to grain crops. Peasants in these areas traded with each other for the goods they lacked. But all regions traded their agricultural goods with the Hanseatic League merchants, who dominated the Baltic trade in coastal areas of northern Europe until as late as 1800 in exchange for beer and cloth. Consumption patterns changed very slowly, and this was particularly true of food consumption. Food choices were often determined not only by locational factors, but also by religious observance. For example, the Christians' yearly fast at Lent increased the demand for fish at that time of year. The Jewish and Islamic prohibition on the consumption of pork is another example. Religious festivals and feast days regularly increased demand for certain foodstuffs. Most food consumption was based on locally available crops. But some areas achieved such notoriety for their food products that they were traded far and wide. Beer, wine, and cheese from various regions were routinely shipped all across Europe. Even lower status households, like the Danish peasants I just mentioned, enjoyed imported wine and beer. The next most important component of consumption is the demand for clothing and cloth. Historical records are difficult to come by for how much of this staple individual households required. Subsistence-level rural households usually clothed themselves with homemade textiles. In the towns, cloth and clothing was more often purchased. Probably the greatest change in the consumption of clothing came with the introduction of cotton cloth to Europe during the 16th century. Cotton cloth came into Europe first from the Middle East and later from India, once the route to India was discovered, brought by European overseas merchants. Cotton cloth was fashionable, and calicos in particular were quite inexpensive. Economic historian Jan de Vries has pointed out that cheap calico was an accelerator of expanded textile demand that really began with a renewed interest in linen, a product that had long been produced in Europe. Linen was comfortable, and the addition of a bright white cloth to an otherwise drab wardrobe of primarily dark-colored woolens caught on quickly. By the 17th century, merchant companies were importing large amounts of printed, brightly colored calicos into Europe from India. Demand for printed calicos was so high, enough to disrupt the local cloth production, that by 1721, the English Parliament had passed laws prohibiting their import. And this would have a profound effect on the establishment of Britain's own textile industry, though that's a story for another time. Despite increased production and the proliferation of new choices in the food textile markets at the time, households still faced constraints on their choices. Sumptuary laws restricted things like the quality, color, and fashionability of clothing according to social status. Sumptuary laws were often aimed at prohibiting lower status individuals from imitating the fashion of higher status individuals. Most sumptuary laws had ancient origins and appear in most civilizations, including those of East Asia and the Islamic world. In Europe, they date to the Middle Ages, and in most parts of Europe, remained an important source of regulation of private behavior until the 19th century. Even small differences in status could be signaled by clothing choices. And sumptuary regulations were dealt with not only within the legal system, but also by social monitoring through sermons, gossip, exhortations, and the like. Sumptuary regulations also applied to the public consumption of food. Regulations of food consumption were intended to ensure that lower status individuals didn't hold lavish feasts for special occasions. Acting above one's station was not only frowned upon in all aspects of life, it was prosecuted. In England and the Netherlands, sumptuary laws were increasingly ignored by the 16th and 17th centuries. So northwestern Europe is where the indicators of an industrious revolution are most prevalent with regard to consumption. Even in spite of the constraints, like sumptuary regulations on consumption in other parts of Europe, the sources suggest that households still wanted to consume more, and that they increased their work hours in order to do so. Increased demand for products from the East, like Indian calicos, is only part of the story. Colonial goods, such as spices, coffee, tea, and sugar, found ready markets in Europe. Colonial products were usually introduced into Europe by the so-called India companies that were founded in the 17th century. The Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, and eventually India companies from other countries as well, imported these goods in large quantities once the products became accepted by consumers. Tea, for example, entered Europe via the Dutch East India Company in 1610, but struggled to find a market. By the end of the 17th century, demand shot dramatically upward as Europeans began incorporating tea into their food consumption patterns. Remember, I mentioned a moment ago that food consumption patterns change very slowly. The volume of imports of tea and coffee, to name just two products, were far too high to suggest that only the elites were consuming them. No, even the lowest status people in society became regular consumers of these new colonial products. Tobacco, on the other hand, took off quickly, almost from its introduction in Europe. And once the English introduced tobacco cultivation to their North American colonies, supply increased to the level where it could be considered mass consumption. The story of consumption goes beyond food, fiber, and exotic products. Goods produced within Europe were also very much part of the mix. And in the context of an industrious revolution, they were probably even more important than items to satisfy basic needs. Small merceries or textile-based dry goods like buttons, ribbons, and small textiles. Larger products like furnishings and housewares. Technological breakthroughs like clocks, watches, and looking glasses. The list could go on and on. All of these things were routinely transported all over the continent to meet new consumer demand. For the most part, these were everyday manufactured goods of use to a wide range of social classes. Essentially, they were amenities, not necessary for survival, but nice to have, and their availability skyrocketed. For example, the range of 16th century imports from England into Ireland on the fringes of the European continent grew from roughly 60 different items at the turn of the century to more than 400 items by about 1600. As overseas colonies became more established, the colonies too increased their consumption of manufactured goods. In the Chesapeake colonies of North America, modern-day Virginia and Maryland, early settlers had to be content with minimal comforts and usually with homemade products. By the early 18th century, however, imports from Europe became increasingly available and increased dramatically in number, much like the earlier case of Ireland. By 1715, for example, people in the Chesapeake colonies could purchase tea service sets, looking glasses, cutlery, clocks and watches, and various types of other furnishings. By the middle of the 18th century, the social elites could acquire china tableware, candelabra, prints, kitchen gadgets, and the like. While high and middling classes of people in Europe and the colonies consumed a greater variety and volume of goods for use in the household, poorer folks also increased their consumption, but in different ways. The historian Jan de Vries has shown that for lowest status households, consumption patterns changed to focus on activities outside of the household, and that individual consumption, rather than household patterns, increased during the 18th century as more and more households consisted of more than one income earner. So the concept of an industrious revolution emerged once scholars identified an increase in demand reflected in consumption patterns around the year 1600. It continued right through the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. While some evidence suggests that consumption of foodstuffs increased only incidentally, the demand for non-local foodstuffs was quite pronounced. This was especially true as the flow of spices and exotic foodstuffs from overseas gained favor, and as Europeans began incorporating these new luxury items into their food routines. More importantly, demand for goods that could not be produced by the household in a given locality and goods that fell outside of guild regulation rose significantly. The new demand for non-essential, if not quite luxury goods, drove supply. Prices obviously rose too, but in general, people and households were willing to work harder in order to pay for increased levels of consumption. And while an increase in work or industriousness is the hallmark of this theory, it is this very aspect that has come under most fire by some scholars. Looking at two industries, sawmills in England and grain threshing, the scholars Clark and van der Werf found no solid evidence for increase in hours worked. In sawmills, they identify increased output, but this they attribute to better technologies. Clearly, more study needs to be done on this issue, because the work habits found in two rural industries are probably not sufficient to make a general claim. It is possible that constraints of a variety of types worked against the general trend of people to work more hours in order to increase their consumption of products. In other words, although people might have wanted to work more to afford certain goods, social norms could work against them. Guilds, religious institutions, and town governments and elites enforced social norms. Constraints against changes in labor allocations were not too different from the sumptuary regulations that constrained consumption. In some parts of Europe, these constraints were greater than in other parts. So overarching generalizations are a problem. In any event, it is clear that the household economy and consumer behavior were undergoing significant change in Europe and its colonies by the middle of the 17th century. Consumption increased at a rate that producers initially couldn't supply quickly enough. Though not particularly well studied, it is likely that demand for goods also fueled the fires of industrial innovation and invention,